Perfect. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to chat with us about your lovely book. Have my copy right here with us. Oop, nope. Background doesn't like it, so I'll hold it like this. Oh my goodness. Okay, so welcome. For those viewing later when we post this on our social media, so I am Leah Brown. I'm the Assistant Director for Education at the Moton Museum. We have with us here lawyer and author Teri Kanefield, who wrote the book The Girl from the Tar Paper School. She's agreed to hang out with us for a little bit and chat. So thank you.
Oh, glad to be here.
Okay. So being a lawyer and an author, I mean, you've written books and short stories, essays, and of course, legal briefings. Tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you learn about Barbara Johns and what inspired you to write this book?
Well, for me, the story begins in 2000 as I was preparing to go to law school. So for 7 years before that, I had taught English at the college level, and I was working through the summer reading list. So the law school put out a list of suggested reading for the summer, and the idea was you were supposed to pick 1 or 2 books that interested you. Well, I'll confess that I rather methodically and maybe compulsively read the whole list, and that was how I happened to find Richard Krueger's book called Simple Justice, which purports. Have you read it?
Not yet. It's on my list.
It's on your list. It's awesome. It purports to be about Brown v. Board of Education, which is the case that declared segregation illegal and desegregated the schools. But really, it's a history of African Americans all the way through hundreds of years. So it's an awesome book. And while reading that book was when I hit on the story of Barbara Johns, because I had never heard of Barbara Johns, and I started asking around, and nobody I knew had heard of Barbara Johns. I even asked a friend who taught African American history at the college level, and she had never heard of Barbara Johns.
Yeah.
Of course, that was before there was a museum, Moton Museum, and that was before there was that big statue about
the Capitol in Richmond,
honoring Barbara Johns, exactly, at the Capitol. So at the same time, I was working through this list and getting ready for law school. My first book was about to come out. It was a historical novel for middle grade readers, and it was set in 18th century Prague. And I was casting around for another idea, and I thought, this story's great. I want to write about Barbara Johns. So people ask me, well, it's kind of a big departure, right? From this first book, Rivka's Way, to the story of Barbara Johns. And I didn't see it as a departure. Okay. So the character in my first book, Rivka, she was 15 years old. And at the time, the Jews in 18th century Prague lived in ghettos. They lived in a walled ghetto. And people lived their entire life behind these walls. So now Barbara was also cut off from the larger community. There wasn't a literal wall, but there were metaphoric walls.
Absolutely. Jim Crow America. Yep.
So I saw thematic similarities. And there were differences, obviously. Rivka just wanted to go on the other side. She just wanted to see what was out there. Barbara, who is a little more radical, wanted to bring the wall down. So anyway, so that's how I found the story and how I get interested in the story.
Perfect. Excellent. Here at Moton, we tell Barbara John's story every single day. It's an honor to do that. A part of her story, she and other students in 1951 inspired over 450 students to walk out to protest inadequate school spaces. And that turned into a court case, Davis v. County School Board of Prince Edward County, which then was part of the Brown v. Board cases. So one small action had great national impact. So there's that story there. Okay, so you refer to the story as the advent of the civil rights movement. Can you just expand a little bit on that?
Certainly. So common wisdom says that the modern American civil rights movement began in the mid-50s when Brown v. Board was decided. And then within a year of Brown v. Board being decided, we had the kickoff, we had the Montgomery bus strike.
Mm-hmm.
And this is when most people think of the modern civil rights movement beginning. But Brown v. Board wasn't the beginning. The beginning happened 4 years earlier with a girl who was 16 at the time, who set in motion the events which brought Brown v. Board to the Supreme Court. So in a very real sense, the American Civil Rights Movement began in Moton High School in Farmville, Virginia.
Nice.
And it's a story that really wasn't told. And a few scholars have put forward some theories as to why Barbara's story wasn't told. Now, the people who came later, they knew about Barbara. Her uncle was one of the leaders of the Civil Rights Movement. And this case, Brown v. Board, was one of the most important cases of the century. So people knew who she was, but she wasn't credited in any way. People looked for, and what her strike was a nonviolent protest designed to further civil rights. And the only time that had been done in the United States was with labor unions. And she took her inspiration from the labor unions. But it was really the first of its kind. And later, when the civil rights leaders looked for their inspiration, they went back to Mahatma Gandhi, and they went to Thoreau, and they went to earlier sources, and they skipped over Barbara Johns. And I got interested in that. How did she become so invisible? Why was she forgotten until Richard Krueger picked up the story and a few other people like me found the story? Why was she so invisible? Well, when I was in law school, I took a course called Feminist Jurisprudence, and I read a scholar, and the name probably just popped out of my head, but I read a scholar who talked about what she called a triple invisibility. So she said the triple invisibility was being Black, female, and poor. So these were people who obviously at a certain point in our history weren't visible. I would add a third element to Barbara, which is she was a child.
Yeah.
She was a child in the 50s when children were supposed to be really seen, not heard. And in fact, she was 16. The word teenager wasn't invented yet. So she was considered a child at the age of 16. And so people talked about the children. Now we would say teenager, we would say young adult. We have books like Hunger Games where young people that age save the world. But it wasn't really part of the thinking at the time that a 16-year-old girl could influence national politics and who could make such an impact on the country and on a very important movement to come.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And here in Prince Edward, Barbara Johns, she's community, she's family for a lot of people in Prince Edward County. So it's always interesting because I fairly recently moved to Prince Edward, to Farmville. I learned about the story a couple of years ago, and I'm a historian, and I've read eons and tons of books and articles, but had missed this story somehow. So it's interesting and honestly to me, so important to get that story out for students because she was 16 when this happened. The power of a 16-year-old, like what their voice and advocating for themselves as citizens, so important. But then within the book, she's 16. So you have she's living with her grandmother's, depending on what year it is, and she's a high schooler. So you have that mentality of she's still in high school, but she's looking at the wider picture, how she's impacted, how her classmates are impacted, her community is being impacted. So I like how the book fleshes her out as a person, not just an event in the movement.
Well, when I came into this, I had written a novel, and my law was a second career. My first career was teaching college English, and I have a master's in English with an emphasis in creative writing. Actually, it lends itself to some jokes, right? I'm a lawyer. I'm trained as a creative writer. I used to joke, I do criminal appeals, so I joke that there are justices in California who think I only write fiction. But fiction writing does teach you to look at the character and the person. And so, and also I was writing for young people when I really tried to flesh her out as a person. And so that was a lot of what informed my research.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of research,
For ways to flesh her out.
what sources did you look for or use when you were trying to plan out, I guess, how you even got the project started?
Well, when I started, all I had was those few pages about her story in Richard Krueger's book and his bibliography. And so there wasn't much. And so there was really no way to, you Googled, nothing would come up. That was before Google was really so big anyway. So you actually had to go to libraries and look through microfilm. So the first thing I did is I called Barbara John's sister, Joan.
Yes.
Yeah, so I called her and she let me interview her. Actually, over the years, we've gotten to be good friends. But initially, she was like, who is this person calling me from California, asking me about my sister? And there were some bad experiences because during this quiet period, sort of after the, sort of the bad some turmoil in the counties died down, Barbara was blamed. So she was blamed for turning her native county into a battleground and into stirring, just pegged as a troublemaker. So when I first started making phone calls, I think people were a little skeptical. Who was I and what did I want? And I come from so far away, the other side of the country. But she allowed me to interview her and we got to know each other. And she then started introducing me to some family members. I made 2 trips to Farmville and I sat on a lot of front porches and I helped look through old images and I spoke to a lot of people and I pieced together the story. What I learned from a reference librarian in Richmond was that in the year, when the events happened in 1951, some reporters from a newspaper that's now defunct, the Richmond Afro-American, sent reporters, and they were actually at the important church meeting. They took notes.
Oh, the rally at First Baptist?
The one where they sort of rallied, right.
Yeah, okay.
Rallied the community. So they were there. And they wrote an article. So that's contemporaneous account.
Yeah.
Right? Firsthand account. And so I started with that. And I tried to get people to tell me not just the details of what I could get in a history book, but what were people wearing? What did she actually say? So where were you sitting when you had this discussion? So I tried to get these kinds of details. And I had people say to me, Teri, that was 60 years ago. I can't remember anything yesterday. So, and also it wasn't, nobody had really been writing the story or asking about the story. So the way that I did the research for this is I kept cycling back. So I started with more the contemporaneous reporting and I showed it to people who would say, oh, I remember. And they'd look at the picture in the newspaper, the old newspaper that I got off microfilm and say, oh, look, that's me, that's where I was sitting.
Oh,
so
nice.
when they remembered where they were sitting, then they remembered things that were happening. And so they filled in some details for me. Awesome. And Barbara herself wrote an account, which I got in the museum. You all gave it to
her
me.
memory, absolutely.
It's the one, right. The first time I went to Farmville, you didn't have it. And the second time I went to Farmville, the notes that the sort of short memoir she had written was available. So you had a stapled copy and you gave me a copy. So I used that because that was written in 1991. So the closer you get to the events, the better people's memory.
Absolutely. So trying to blend those primary sources from the newspapers and images. So the rally at First Baptist is when the entire community in Farmville and Prince Edward decided whether they should pursue the court case. The whole community was going to be impacted. The whole community showed up to say, like,
the whole community was going to be in danger.
Yeah, danger, absolutely. Because Jim Crow America, danger was everywhere, and the threat of violence was always everywhere. Virginia has this unique perspective that it's civil. No violence happened, but schools were closed for 5 years. So that's a form of violence. That's not actually physical. So yeah, you have those.
Well, and Barbara's home was also, her home was also burned. So that was an act of violence.
So the family home was, I think in 54 burned. There was a cross burning at Moton at the school. So yeah.
There was some violence.
Yeah.
It was, and Barbara, of course, her life was threatened. And so she was sent down south to live with her uncle.
which it surprised me the first time I heard that when she left, she went to Montgomery, but her uncle, Reverend Vernon Johns, lived there. And this is prior to the big civil rights movement beginning. So.
And I had people say to me in Virginia, the fact that she was sent to Alabama,
yeah,
right, for safety,
ooh,
that was just wrong, because the idea always was the deeper south you went, the more dangerous. And they sent her from Virginia all the way down, but her life was threatened. And so piecing the story was very interesting, because any lawyer knows that when you have two eyewitness accounts, you're going to have some differences. People will remember things differently. People will have different perceptions. And so I cycled back. I would say to person A, oh, but person B remembered it this way. And I would end up sort of using my judgment where there were some minor differences, where I could get more of a consensus about what happened. So I think that I reconstructed everything as accurately as I could. And it was really almost all primary sources.
Yeah.
Because of the nature of it.
Absolutely. And that adds to the power of the piece itself, because the voices, when I was reading it, I was like, wait, I know that. That's from her memoir. That's Barbara John's voice right there on paper. So definitely it comes out and you can tell. Okay, so about how long did it take you to write this book, including research?
When I tell you how long it was from the time I got the idea of the book until the time it was published, you're going to say, what is she, in the slow group? I first got the idea in the year 2000. Mm-hmm. The book was not published till 2014.
Okay.
And I can say that I've never had writer's block, although I was in law school, so I didn't have as much time to write. And I did the bar exam, and I did have, family. So things went slower on my end, but I entirely attribute it to what I call publisher's block. So publisher's block is when you have this great idea and you try to sell it to publishers, and you get back an awful lot of no's. And one of the problems initially, or actually one thing that, the way I initially submitted this book was as a historical novel. It wasn't in the form it's in now. So I initially submitted it as a historical novel because I knew how to do that. My first book was historical fiction. So I sent it, it finally landed on the desk of the editor who didn't say no. He was an editor at Abrams, and he has a strong interest in civil rights. He's actually from North Carolina. Okay. So he has a strong interest in civil rights, and he said he'd like to publish it, but he wanted me to redo it as a biography. I mean, as, just nonfiction. And so that was when I did the research trips.
Okay.
Because writing it as when I wrote it as a novel, I could imagine things. I could go from pictures. I could take liberties, because that's what you can do with fiction. But he said, this is, and I think he thought this is an important story. Actually, what he said was, I did some research and I found out Teri's right. And he was a little bit appalled that he had never heard of her, because he considered himself a publisher of stories from the civil rights movement. And so he did some research, decided I was right. And his sort of, what he brought to the book was saying, no, this really needs to be a biography. This needs to be nonfiction. And he's a very good editor, and he understands bringing the voice in. So every chance I could, I used Barbara's own voice, Barbara's words. Awesome. So it was a long time. So it was a very, very long time. It was 2 research trips, but it was also just a long process to finally see the book to publication.
Yeah, I mean, knowing that you rewrote it, how did you scale that language to a younger audience?
Oh, it had been written always for, but okay, I'll say something about that. I write for appellate justices, and I write for adult. I write NBC op-eds on occasion. I write for adult markets, but I also write for young readers. And there is no difference. I believe I write the same way that I write for appellate justices that I do for young readers. And the only difference is with young readers, you have to define everything. Okay. And sometimes with adults, you don't have to, but even then you do. And so with appellate briefs, what I do in an appellate brief is I take a lot of law and I break it down very simply for the judge. That's what an appellate brief is. And so I actually don't, nothing really changes, nothing really scales. I don't find, I think the only difference is they publish it more, they spread it out more, so there's fewer words on the page, and it's broken down a little bit more in terms of paragraphing, but I actually don't write any differently. I will say that as far as comparing one set of my readers, which would be middle school readers, and another set, which would be appellate judges, middle school readers are just as smart. They're certainly more fun. They're more open-minded. So it isn't that I scale anything at all. The only difference is I will explain. So if I use a word that maybe the young people won't know, due process, for example.
Yeah.
I think even adults, most adults probably could have due process defined for them, or how a case, gets to the court.
Cool. Well, definitely important to be able to reach your reader and have them understand exactly what you're trying to portray or say. So definitely explaining those terms, essential, definitely essential. Okay. Is there a image from the book that's like, you could say is your favorite or one that stands out to you?
Oh, my favorite. I don't think anybody's ever asked me that question. So I think that for me, it's of course that image of her on the stage, because she did it, and it was her. It wasn't a committee. It wasn't a group. It was her. It was the power of her personality. It was her words, and she got up there, and people were shocked. So for people who haven't, a little bit of introduction, what happened was Barbara staged this walk out of her high school, and she had to do it in secret. The adults couldn't know, because she knew that there was going to be a lot of anger from the white community, and she wanted to protect the teachers. Teachers could get fired. Principals could be fired. So she had to protect the adults. So she carried this out entirely on her own. Nobody knew about it. They would not have given her permission for this. And so what she did is she tricked the principal. I won't tell you, actually that's probably the fun part, right? They tricked the principal out of the school. So they tricked the principal out of the school by, somebody goes, that was John, which one? No, Stokes. No, not John Stokes. There were two Johns, right? Anyway, one of the students, it's been a while, one of the students goes off campus, off the school, disguises his voice, calls the principal and says, some of your students are in trouble with the police. You better get downtown. Well, African-American high school students in trouble with an all-white police force in Virginia was very serious. So the principal hops into his car, goes tearing out of the school. As soon as the principal was out of the school, the students, there was a committee that took around notes. Barbara forged them. So there were forged notes from the principal saying everybody needs to come to the assembly. So she stages this coup. Basically, she takes over the school. So all the students come to the assembly, and they see Barbara on the stage. And she tells them all, this is what we're doing. We are going to have a walkout. We are going on strike. And there was kind of horror and fear, and there was some debates. And she was up there, and she was the one who marshaled the students. And there were very frightened students. And so I think that's probably the moment, and the moment when the students trick the principal. I say the moment the students trick the principal. I think I do have a subversive part of me. There was just something about these kids like taking over the school in the interest of racial equality.
Yeah.
Right. They had a noble goal. They were going to protest, and they had a goal. They had in mind exactly what they thought they were going to accomplish, and they accomplished more.
Absolutely. So Mr. John Watson was the one.
That was him. He was the one.
Yeah. He has like the
John Watson.
He was one who actually phoned the principal. So how the principal, Boyd Jones, his mentality about his students was, you were always respectable regardless of where you are in the community, in the county. You're held accountable and to a certain level of respectability at all times. Again, Jim Crow America, part of that is to protect those students. So when he leaves, The notes are Barbara John signed them BJ.
Which is her initials,
Her
and
initials, but the teacher's top boy Joe.
actually forged his name. So she wasn't even a lawyer, and she already knew how to split the hairs here. She already had her defense, right? Boy Jones, the principal, Barbara Johns. So no, she couldn't. Barbara Johns called the meeting.
And like what's amazing to me about that day is their parents had done all like they were supposed to do. Like they talked to the school board, they had lobbied, they had parent teachers conferences, like they did all these things. And the students were the ones who were like, okay, it's not working, let's try something else. Which is important because again, student agency, students have a voice. One of the funnier stories that I've heard about that day was Miss Jones' response, Barbara's little sister, and how when the curtains open, she sees her sister. She's like, what is happening?
Yeah, she was. Yeah, she described it as, actually the first time, that was on the telephone, the first time she told me, she kept trying to describe what she did in her chair, right? She kept trying to describe it. So this is where, when you remember back 60 years. And then the next time I talked to her, she said, I can tell you what happened. And she described it like this. She said, I squirmed down into my chair because she knew her sister was a powerhouse, and she knew her sister was capable of turning the town upside down, which she did. And so she sees her big sister up there, and she squirmed down. She was really, really scared. Like, what is Barbara doing? And you know something, Joan's fear was not misplaced, because, as I said, Barbara did change our history. Really, she did a lot. It was a huge movement, but things don't happen quickly.
Right.
That's one thing that people don't always understand, is it happens slowly. Things happen much more slowly than you want them to happen. And the more immediate responses was a lot of hate coming at them and danger. And so it wasn't like Barbara was this powerhouse and her sister's fear was, somehow misplaced. Fear is sometimes a healthy, sort of a healthy response, but on the other hand, at some point you have to take it on. At some point, and Barbara's idea was Barbara thought they're not going to hurt children. So we're doing this, not the adults, because they're not going to hurt us. And the adults have nothing to do with this. We're not listening to them. If they tell us to go back to school, this is not theirs. And so Barbara was completely fearless. And actually, I asked Joan at one point to describe Barbara. A lot of people asked to describe Barbara. And fearless was the word. And Joan said it not me, I was a coward.
Yeah, I mean, it takes gumption. It takes conviction. Like, we're doing this. It's happening. Get ready. It's coming.
And we're going to take the heat.
Yeah.
And I'm in charge. I'll take the heat. I'll take the blame.
And we always say at Moton that the strike had consequences. So you have this big victory, this big moment, but then the direct response is Barbara has to leave. She has to leave her community and start in a new place all over again. So we have that dynamic as well. Okay. We've covered a lot. Is there anything you'd like what would you like your readers to take away from the book?
The future belongs to young people. Young people have the power to create the kind of future that they want. And the message that I want young people to take away from this book is, you have the power. Use your power.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of what we do with students at Moton is say, no, you have a voice. Use your voice. Depending on the age, you change how you say it, but same mentality of, you're here, you're part of this country, you're a citizen, you have rights, and the rights, some of them have expectations. You have to be willing to say, wait a minute, this isn't okay. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us here at Moton. Do you have any questions for us?
I don't. Thank you. I'm so happy you're doing this. So this is for the students learning remotely right now?
Yes, students learning remotely, parents learning remotely. Anybody who wants, like, just wants the community to engage. So the book is available through the library here using the Hoopla app. I checked that out. It's an ebook. In case somebody doesn't have the actual text in front of them. Well, thank you again. It's been wonderful being able to actually speak with you versus just sending emails back and forth.
You're wonderful. Thank you so much.
Alrighty, you have a great day.
Thank you.